1 Corinthians 15:45 reads, "Thus it is written, the first man Adam became a living being, the last Adam became a life-giving spirit." In the exegesis of Faustus Socinus, this brief declaration invites a careful, scripture-bound inquiry into what Paul intends by last Adam and by the phrase life-giving spirit. Socinus insisted that the meaning must be sought in the plain sense of the text together with the consistent teaching of the Old and New Testaments, all the while preserving the unity of God and the ethical demand of Christ's example. Socinus begins by recalling the opening of Scripture when it is said of the first man that Adam became a living being, Genesis chapter 2 verse 7. The language describes a man formed of the dust and animated by the breath of God. The life of Adam is contingent, derived, and corporeal. It is the gift of the one living God. Paul's parallel calling Christ the last Adam does not therefore require a secret ontological identity between Christ and the divine essence. Rather, Socinus maintains, Paul is drawing a comparison of roles and effects. Where Adam by his sin introduced death and condemnation, the Messiah by his obedience and work becomes the source through which life is restored to those who are his, a point Paul develops elsewhere when he compares the consequences of Adam and of Christ, Romans 5:12-19. To understand life-giving spirit, Socinus emphasizes the meaning of spirit in Scripture as that which quickens and communicates life, not necessarily as a title of an independent divine person. Jesus himself taught that the Spirit gives life, John 6:63, and that the Father has life in himself and shares life with the Son by grant and appointment, John 5:26. From these passages, Socinus reasons that the power by which the Messiah gives life is not an assertion that he is the one and only living God in essence, but that he is the instrument and agent by whom God bestows life. The title life-giving Spirit marks Jesus' function in the economy of salvation. Through his obedience, death, and resurrection, he is made the channel of the Spirit's vivifying work. Socinus further reads Paul in light of the New Testament testimony that the risen Christ received the Spirit from the Father and was exalted to a place of authority, Acts chapter 2 verse 33, Philippians 2:5-11. The humiliation and subsequent exaltation described by Paul in Philippians indicate a sequence. Christ, though here designated Son, is vindicated and invested by God after his earthly obedience. Thus, the bestowal of life upon sinners through Christ proceeds from the sovereign will of one God, who alone is the source of being and holiness. This reading preserves the strict unity of God so often affirmed in Scripture, as when Israel is instructed, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one," Deuteronomy 6:4. Socinus regarded any interpretation that dissolved this unity into multiple co-equal persons as contrary to Scripture and to reason, when Paul calls Christ a spirit in the phrase life-giving spirit. Socinus insists that this must be understood with attentiveness to language elsewhere in the Scriptures. The word rendered spirit may denote an influence, power, or office, here the effectual power by which the risen Christ communicates life to believers. The same New Testament speaks of the Spirit being given to believers, of Christ's intercession, and of resurrection as God's act through Christ, woven together without requiring that Christ be the same in essence as the Father. For example, the apostolic witness that the Father raised from the dead and gave him the name above every name, Acts and the Epistles, fits with the thought that Christ receives authority and power from God to fulfill the role of life-giver. Socinus also appeals to the Old Testament patterns of sonship and appointment. The psalmist's words, "You are my son, today I have begotten you," Psalms chapter 2 verse 7, when taken alongside apostolic citation, mark a relationship in which God the Father bestows position and authority upon the Son. This begetting, in Socinus's reading, does not imply co-eternity of essence, but points to the Father's act in raising and appointing the Messiah. The same thought surfaces in Paul's own language. Christ is firstborn among many brethren, Romans and Colossians, a term that implies priority of office and honor, rather than identity of substance with God. From these premises, Socinus draws practical and ethical conclusions. If Christ is the life-giving Spirit by virtue of his obedient office and by God's sovereign grant, then believers are summoned not to worship Christ as though he were the one God in essence, but to honor him according to the witness of Scripture as teacher, exemplar, and mediator whose obedience and self-sacrifice reconcile men to God. The imitation of Christ becomes central. His humility and fidelity are to be copied. For it was by such obedience that he was fitted to become the instrument of life. The law of God, given first to Israel and repeated in the New Testament command to love God and neighbor, remains the standard, and Christ's example illumines its true force. Moreover, Socinian insists that reverence must be directed to the one God, who alone is unbegotten, self-existent, and the true fountain of life. Texts that speak of God's singular life and sovereignty, like those in the prophets and the Shema of Deuteronomy, constrain any theology that would distribute the prerogatives of God to another who is not God by nature. Yet this insistence on the unity of God does not diminish Christ's role, rather it clarifies it. Christ is the servant and Son through whom the one God accomplishes the redemption of men. When Paul calls him the last Adam, it highlights the counteracting power of Christ's obedience to the ruin wrought by the first Adam, an effectual remedy provided by God through his chosen mediator. Finally, Socinian would remind hearers that the ethical consequence of this understanding is immediate. Those who receive life through Christ are to live in accordance with the newness of life he proclaims, guided by the Spirit that God supplies. This life is the restoration of what was lost in Adam, moral renewal, a turning to God, and the practice of righteousness. The faithful response is therefore obedience to God's commandments, imitation of Christ's humility and love, and worship directed to the one God who alone is Creator and Lord. In this way, the interpretation of 1 Corinthians 15:45 offered by Socinian connects doctrinal clarity about the unity of God with the moral and spiritual demands that follow from the gospel itself. In closing, I want to encourage you, examine for yourself, search diligently, read the scriptures with an open and rational mind. Socinianism does not rest on tradition or church authority, but on the conviction that God's truth is rational, clear, and morally sublime. If this perspective has resonated with you and you wish to explore the biblical Unitarian view further, visit www.socinianismus.de for in-depth articles, studies, and reflections on central theological questions. If this video has been helpful, please support this work with a like and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another contribution on the unity of God, the teaching of Jesus, and the rational interpretation of Scripture. Until the next video.